And welcome back to Deck Building. I'm your host Demo, and this is 10 cards you want in your graveyard for Commander. You know, I was making a couple of decks recently, some for me, some for patrons, some were deck techs on my channel, and I was thinking of cards, you know, a lot of discard themed stuff lately, and I thought, you know, there's a lot of cards that you want in your graveyard, and some I have committed to memory, but I started thinking, you know, maybe it would be good to actually have a list. You know, if you're making a deck where you want to be putting stuff in your graveyard all the time, there's a lot of cards in the game that actually want to be in your graveyard, that would prefer to be in your graveyard than anywhere else. So I thought I would make a list of it, and here it is. Coming in at number 10 is Nether Spirit, 1 black, Spirit 2/2. At the beginning of your upkeep, if Nether Spirit is the only creature card in your graveyard, you may return Nether Spirit to the battlefield. So this is sort of holding the place of a lot of creatures that want to be in your graveyard. You know, I wasn't going to make them all. I could probably make a top 10 list of just creatures that want to be in your graveyard. Nether Trader is a great one. Obviously, Bloodghast is a great one. There's lots of them that can go in your graveyard, and you basically cheat them into play after the fact. This is one that I really like because you pay nothing. At the beginning of your upkeep, it just goes directly into play. You don't have to pay anything. You don't have to do anything. It just goes directly into play on your upkeep if it's the only creature card in your graveyard. I really like that. Speaking of creatures that want to be in your graveyard, Daring Fiend Bonder coming in at number 9, and this one really wants to be in your graveyard because you really don't want it anywhere else, right? That's what this list is all about. This is about cards that you want them in your graveyard because they have some sort of ability that only works when they're in your graveyard, right? Daring Fiend Bonder has been a personal favorite of mine ever since it came out in Commander 2020. 3 and a black, human warlock, 5/1 with haste. Daring Fiend Bonder attacks each combat if able. So really, none of that is that important. Basically, all of that is I'm attacking my opponents. Hopefully they're going to block. That's why it's a 5/1. You want them to block so that it dies and goes to your graveyard, because the other ability is the one that you really want. 1 and a black, exile Daring Fiend Bonder from your graveyard, right? So it only works when it's in your graveyard. Put an indestructible counter on target creature. Activate this ability only time you can cast a sorcery. It's just fantastic in any deck. I've put this in a few decks. In any deck where you don't want your commander to be removed, for example, or just 2 mana, I put an indestructible counter on my commander, and now it's really hard to get off the table. I think is definitely worth it. And again, it's a card that you want more so in your graveyard than anywhere else. Coming in at number 8, Bridge from Below, black, enchantment. Whenever a non-token creature is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, if Bridge from Below is in your graveyard, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Whenever a creature is put into an opponent's graveyard from the battlefield, if Bridge from Below is in your graveyard, exile Bridge from Below. So this really is the quintessential card for this list because it does literally nothing unless it's in your graveyard, right? If you cast this and it's in play, it's a 3-mana enchantment that just sits there and does nothing. You want it in your graveyard, right? It doesn't do anything unless it's in your graveyard. And if it's in your graveyard, whenever a non-token creature you control would die, you're going to create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. That's really good. Okay, that's fantastic. However, you really don't see this maybe in Commander as much as you could. Probably though, because whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you exile it from your graveyard. So as soon as any opponent's creature dies, this gets exiled from your graveyard. You don't get to use it anymore, right? So your opponent has a Sakura Tribe Elder, they sacrifice it to go get a land, this gets exiled from your graveyard. So it's not going to stay in your graveyard for very long. That's the downside here. In a Commander game, like I say all the time, creatures are dying all over the place. So you really, I think, have to time this. Maybe you put it in a deck where you can discard it. You can, at instant speed, chuck it into your graveyard. Maybe your opponent's about to board wipe. You discard this into your graveyard. Maybe you're playing an Asmi deck and you have that Underworld Cookbook in play. You can just discard this at instant speed into your graveyard. Your board gets wiped. Both of those triggers will go to the stack at the same time because your opponent's creatures are dying as well, but you still get all those zombie tokens. You know, something like that I think is probably where you want to use it, but it definitely is a card that you're going to want in your graveyard. Coming in at number 7, Carrionette, another card that you absolutely want in your graveyard, and another personal favorite of mine, 1 and a black skeleton 1/1. And you can pay 2 black, exile Carrionette and target creature unless that creature's controller pays 2. Activate only if Carrionette is in your graveyard. So again, another card that does nothing. It's just a 1/1 skeleton if it's in play. If this is in play, it's just a 2-mana 1/1 that does nothing. The ability only works if it's in your graveyard. And I really just love this. I love this card because it just sits in your graveyard. Nobody's paying attention to it. Nobody cares. First of all, it's an exile effect in black, which is good. If there's a creature on the board you really want to get rid of, you just wait for your moment. Your opponents are going to forget about it. They're going to tap out. You pay the 4, you exile it. The interesting thing here, though, is it's just like with Mangara of Karondor, right? Mangara's ability is you just tap. That's the activation for that ability. Exiling him is part of the resolution, just like with Carrionette. Exiling Carrionette is part of the resolution. So what you can do is you can pay that 4 mana and then respond again and pay the 4 mana again. If you're really desperate and you got to exile a creature and your opponent does have the 2 mana, you can activate the ability again, right? So now they have to pay 2 mana again in order to have their creature not exiled. Also, and I made a deck once like this, it was really interesting. It was actually an Adun Oakenshield deck, and Adun has the ability where you can tap him to return a creature from your graveyard to your hand. And again, you can respond to your own trigger here where you pay the 4 on your Carrionette to exile a creature, and then in response, you use your Adun or any other effect. You can use Phyrexian Reclamation if you want, and return Carrionette from your graveyard to your hand so that when the ability resolves, your opponent's creature gets exiled, your Carrionette does not because it's no longer in your graveyard, right? So there's some tricks you can get into there as well. Really interesting card. Coming in at number 6, Vengeful Pharaoh. And this is a card that it does something when it's on the battlefield. I mean, it definitely does. It's a 5 mana, 2 black zombie, 5/4 with Death Touch, right? So that's something. It's definitely not doing nothing on the battlefield. However, the ability you really want is only going to work while it's in the graveyard. Whenever combat damage is dealt to you or a planeswalker you control, if Vengeful Pharaoh is in your graveyard, destroy target attacking creature, then put Vengeful Pharaoh on top of your library. I really like this in a deck where you, again, can constantly either be milling yourself. So any of these cards also work in a deck where you're milling yourself or discarding. So it's going to go on top of your library after you destroy that attacking creature. You're going to draw it again the next turn. And then you want to be able to chuck it in your graveyard again. Works really good in an Egon deck, right? I had put this in my Egon deck because it's going to be in your graveyard. Your opponent smacks you with something. You destroy that creature. Vengeful Pharaoh goes on top of your library. And then you have that throne side on the battlefield. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you're then going to mill your Vengeful Pharaoh into the graveyard again before you draw. So it's a perfect fit in a deck like that. In any deck where you're self-milling, I think it fits really, really well. It is any target attacking creature. You can pick which one you want to destroy. It doesn't even have to actually be the one that's dealing you damage. Great card. It's definitely a card that you probably want in your graveyard over anywhere else, right? Coming in at number 5, Echo of Eons. And again, just like with the Nether Spirit, this is sort of holding the place of a lot of these flashback cards. There are a bunch of flashback cards that you would prefer to have in your graveyard because the flashback cost is actually cheaper than the actual casting cost. I chose this one. I think, each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library, then draws 7 cards. That's a Time Twister, which is in the Power 9. It's one of the most powerful cards ever printed. 6 mana to do that, not great. But if it's in your graveyard, you pay 2 and a blue, which is what Time Twister is, right? You're essentially casting a Time Twister with this if it's in your graveyard, which is fantastic. So that's why for me, I use this as the card that, is sort of holding the place of all those cards, those spells that you would prefer to have them in your graveyard. Dread Return is another one maybe that I think I could probably give a mention. I don't know if it's cheaper to play from your graveyard. It doesn't cost any mana. You got to sacrifice 3 creatures. It's definitely a card that sees a lot of play in the format. Coming in at number 4, Genesis. 4 and a green. Incarnation 4/4. At the beginning of your upkeep, if Genesis is in your graveyard, you may pay 2 and a green. If you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So again, if this is in play, it's just a 5 mana 4/4. That's terrible. You want it in your graveyard, right? You want to be able to chuck this in your graveyard somehow. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you can just pay 3 mana and return any creature card from your graveyard to your hand. That's a pretty great ability in Commander. It used to get played in Commander a lot more. I haven't seen it much much lately. It's just nice to have this sitting in your graveyard. Again, you want it in your graveyard, right? So just sitting in your graveyard, and then in your upkeep, yeah, maybe you'll pay 3 mana and get a creature back out of your graveyard if you want. Do this with your commander. Maybe your commander is always going to be a target. It's going to be dying a lot. In any deck, a green deck, where you have a commander that maybe you want to be dying a lot, you can just use this to return to your hand. People used to use this with a Child of Alara. You know, if you had a Child of Alara deck, you had to let it die in order to get the trigger. I guess you don't have to do that anymore. Nevertheless, it is cheaper paying the 3 mana than having to recast your commander over and over again, right? Coming in at number 3, another one of my personal favorites, Haakon Stromgald Scourge, 3 black, Zombie Knight 3/3, and it has one of the most unique abilities in the entire game. You may cast Haakon Stromgald Scourge from your graveyard, but not from anywhere else. So, I mean, is there another card that wants to be in your graveyard more than this? You can't cast it unless it's in your graveyard. That is a card that absolutely needs to be in your graveyard. This can be your commander too. Again, I already talked about this in my 10 deck ideas video, how, you know, it's tough to make an actual deck with Haakon. You have to get him into your hand, then you have to discard him into your graveyard, then you got to cast him. My hat is off to anyone who has made a Haakon deck. I think he's fantastic in the 99, that you could actually build your deck around him because he is so unique and has such a powerful ability. As long as Haakon is on the battlefield, you may cast night spells from your graveyard. That's a really powerful ability. As we all know, you can do Night Tribal with this, right? I think this goes in a lot of decks, like an Elenda deck. This is a fantastic fit in an Elenda deck because you want your Elenda to die. Just like I was saying with the Genesis, where it's great with any commander that you want to be dying all the time, you want your Elenda to die, and Elenda is a knight. So you can let your Elenda die, go to the graveyard, and stay there, and then just play it from your graveyard the next turn. So this is a fantastic fit in that deck, but you just got to make sure you get it into the graveyard because you can't cast it from anywhere else. Coming in at number 2, and continuing on with more cards that are pretty useless unless they're in the graveyard. Wonder. 3 and a blue incarnation, 2/2 with flying. And again, none of that really matters. The casting cost, the abilities, the power toughness, because you want this in your graveyard. You really don't want it anywhere else, because as long as Wonder is in your graveyard and you control an island, creatures you control have flying. Really, really great. There's a lot of decks that want this. There's a lot of decks that you want to give your creatures evasion, probably get in for damage. It's a card that I see all the time. It gets paid in Commander a lot because it's so easy to discard this into your graveyard, and just giving all your creatures flying is such a fantastic advantage. But coming in at number 1 is Anger. This is the red one of the cycle. 3 in a red, 2/2 incarnation, but again, none of that matters because you're going to want it in your graveyard. I mean, it's got haste, but more importantly, as long as Anger is in your graveyard and you control a mountain, creatures you control have haste. For me, this is number 1. In Commander, I think super, super important to be giving your creatures haste. There's a lot of commanders that want haste. I have this in a couple of decks myself. You got to be careful there. I've actually run into the situation where I had Anger in my graveyard. I chucked it in there and I cast my commander and I'm about to swing and, oh, what's going on? I don't have haste. It's because I didn't have a mountain in play. I actually have gotten into the situation before where I didn't have a mountain in play, and so therefore my creatures didn't have haste. So you just got to be careful with that. Usually it's not an issue though, but just chucking this guy into your graveyard and then for the rest of the game, all of your creatures have haste, that's really a huge advantage. You know, surprise, my creatures come into play and then immediately attack is really good in Commander, as we know. And as we know, there are a lot of commanders that want to be attacking and connecting. A lot of commanders that they have an attack trigger or they have a deal damage trigger, and it's super important for you to get that off right away. And all of those decks are probably going to be putting Anger in there and trying to get it into their graveyard. So that is 10 cards that you want in your graveyard. Obviously, color is an issue. To no one's surprise, a lot of the cards on this list are black. So you're going to need to play a black deck with a lot of these, but usually a black deck is doing that sort of graveyard strategy anyway, or discard strategy, so it fits. That's basically why I made this list, right? I made this list so that if you're playing an Asmi deck, for example, or if you're playing a Gallia of the Endless Dance, like I did in my recent Underwhelming Commanders video, these are options. If you want to be discarding, if your commander is always going to be discarding stuff into your graveyard, these are cards that you can chuck in there that are actually going to give you an advantage rather than just throwing cards away, right? So that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.